So I'm here. I'm Janet Michelson Gavariahu. I'm a member. I've been a member of the board of the library for many years, and I'm the head of the committee of programming. And we are delighted today to have a fellow board member as our speaker. Elizabeth Powers is a former elementary school teacher. She also taught in middle school. She's a reading teacher, a literacy coach, and a trainer of teacher coaches. She's worked in education across the Mid-Atlantic region for over 25 years, and she enjoys sharing information about reading instruction and assessment to a variety of audiences, including teachers, principals, college student volunteers, tutors, parents, and school boards. And Elizabeth is also the parent of a 9-year-old who is a student in the Lower Merion school system. So she has a lot of hands-on knowledge of reading learning.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks very much. Thank you.
I just may, before you start, if I just may say, in case people didn't hear me say it in the beginning, we will have a Q&A when Elizabeth is done. You can certainly put questions in the chat. Just make sure that you have your to part of the chat set to, you can do it to everyone if you don't mind everybody seeing your question, or you can do it to the Bala Cynwyd Library. If you want to keep it more private, or you can also, if time allows, and we don't talk over each other, we can certainly unmute and ask questions that way in an open forum. All right.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Autumn, for all your help. And Janet, thank you. And also thank you, board members, for joining us. Okay, I am going to try and share my screen. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're going to talk about beginning reading tonight, both how we learn to read and then how we can help beginning readers. Okay, take a look at these images and think if you ever were taught to read with materials like this, or like this, or like this. And also this. Great. Okay, I'm going to go back to these. So if you were taught to read with materials that were either these materials or like this, if you could go ahead and write in the chat, just write the name of the materials, or you can write me too. And if you use something that was like this but a little different, you can also put that in the chat. So in about 30 seconds, I'll go to the next one. And so feel free to write in if you use this. I'm going to check the chat right now. Oh, great. Okay. Someone read Dick and Jane. Oh, okay. And SRA cards. Oh, great. Okay, I'll go to the next one. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'll go right back in. Okay, here we go. Okay, I'm sorry, why, hey, Autumn, I'm so sorry. Why can't I advance the slides anymore? Oh, waiting for Amy to control my screen. Okay, Amy, would you be able to give me permission to advance the slides? Okay, well, we get that figured out. I'm gonna look in the chat. Okay, so we see Dick and Jane.
Autumn, not me, Autumn.
Autumn, I'm so sorry, Amy. It's Autumn. If Autumn could, my note says waiting for Amy to control my screen.
Well,
For
it must be
Amy.
Autumn because I have no idea.
Okay.
Waiting for Autumn to. I don't know where that would be.
Okay. You know, I will close the chat. Okay. I think this is going to work. Nope. Oh, no. Oh, maybe
Okay.
All right. Sorry. We're doing so well.
Well, if anybody if anybody on right now can tell me where that feature would be.
Oh, I got it.
There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I think it was my mistake. Okay, so if you taught to read with either these materials, that's Distar and the letter people, go ahead and you can note that in the chat, or you can also put your hand up under the reactions. And then SRA cards, trade books or real books. And lastly, if you are too young for any of the other things, you may have been taught with interactive writing, share the pen writing, where you and the teacher wrote, or each of you wrote something and it was pasted together. And our last example is in current use. It's a literature anthology. Okay, I'm just going to go back. So if you learn to read with materials like this, a McGuffey reader or Dick and Jane, the idea behind these programs were that children should learn to read with whole words, with a complete word. So the McGuffey reader had you memorize words before you started reading and work on them, and then you would find those words in the passage you read. And then for Dick and Jane, what Dick and Jane did is they introduced words to readers one at a time. And as you can see, they would repeat the words so that children would learn them. And once the word had been mastered, they'd introduce another word. So you can tell that the word on page 12 of Dick and Jane is most likely look. Look, Jane, look, look. Look at Dick. And then when you move into this kind of reading program, this is an example of a phonics-based program, a program that's based on learning letters and their sounds. And the way you learn to read is you build up from the letter sounds, then to the words, then to the sentence. And Distar was a scientifically based program that addressed the fact that in English, a single letter can make different sounds. Like G can have the G sound, but in some cases the J sound. Or A can be a, short A, like an apple, or long A, saying its name, A as in gate. So that was their attempt to address that so children wouldn't be as confused by how letters change. And another example is the letter people. I actually used these in kindergarten. We had cards and all the letters had personalities and had rhymes that would help you remember the letter and its name. And also if it was a bossy letter that it tended to dominate, or a letter like Q that needed a friend to help it. Then we're moving into reading programs that think more about the meaning of reading. In other words, do you understand what's going on? The idea is to get the sense of the story and to understand the story. And SRA cards do that. And you continuously read cards that gradually get harder and harder. So you're always looking at your level. And then the whole language movement had an interest in having children read real books, sometimes called trade books. And those are books written by authors directly for children and books you could buy in a store. And then for, I mentioned interactive writing because that's one of the examples of balanced literacy. And balanced literacy is the idea that you can provide different levels of support from adults to students. And one of the things you can do when children are learning to write is do interactive writing, where the teacher guides them, but children can do their own writing with support. And you can see there are white dots in the Dear Room 4 note, and that's if you make a mistake in your writing, the teacher can just paste over it and you can rewrite it. And the final example is a literature anthology that's taken from Journeys, which is used in lots of districts, including Lower Merion, and also someplace in Lower Merion, and also definitely in Philadelphia. And that's a collection of trade books, mostly of complete trade books, but sometimes of edited ones. And the idea is that this anthology has real books in it that can be used. Great. Okay, I'm going to check the chat.
Nobody's gonna want the non-Christmassy ones. Then I have to get a few more because I got the Christmassy
Okay,
ones.
could everybody make sure that they're muted? Because I think we're hearing some background noise. Great. Okay, it is. I will be right back. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. Okay, so based on research that was done in this century, in the 2000s, they discovered by looking at scientifically based reading research that there were five main components of reading. And those components are phonemic awareness, which is just the sounds of language. It's not connected to written letters. It's the idea that you can recognize that rat and cat rhyme, and you can also recognize that splat also rhymes with mat and cat. It's also the idea that you can manipulate the sounds in language. You can take off an initial sound, maybe take off the initial sound in trip and add the initial sound duh, and then you get dip. And there are programs that are very heavily phonemic awareness focused and some that are less so. And then from phonemic awareness, you move into phonics, and that's the idea that letters and sounds are connected, that letters make sounds, and you, as a child beginning to write, you listen to the word, you say it slowly to stretch it, and then you write down the letters that you hear to spell. I'm working with a first grade now, and I've noticed that a lot of the students have great invented or phonetic spelling, that they're writing the sounds that they hear. And when my daughter was starting to write, she would write words. I guess she saw it on my face and she would say, "Is that right?" And I said, "Well, that word sounds right, but unfortunately it doesn't look right the way we write English." So that's something that comes up. And then another component is fluency. And that's the idea that students are able to read connected text, a series of sentences, and they can read them quickly, accurately, but also with appropriate expression and phrasing, so that they're chunking the words together in parts that make meaning. And that's something you can teach specifically by having children read and reread and get feedback on their fluency. Another important component is vocabulary. For example, when struggling readers are working really hard to decode a word, if they decode a word that's not in their vocabulary, they won't recognize it. And even if they do recognize it and they don't know what it means, then that impedes them in terms of making meaning out of reading. And then the fifth component is comprehension, the idea that reading makes sense, that we can learn something from the words. And the other thing to know is that comprehension always has to be taught. You teach it throughout the grade levels. You basically teach different strategies as students encounter more and more complex text, and also as they encounter genre-specific text. Common Core State Standards really has the idea that you want to be a good writer about science and about history and about math if you're doing that. So it's the idea of genre-specific writing and understanding. And the other thing to know is one of the things that helps comprehension the most is the ability to summarize, to read something and then to create a summary of it. And that is really a skill that aids in comprehension. Okay, this is my high quality graphic of the reading tree. I was not able to find the graphic that was developed shortly after the reports came out, and it's a little light, but what I want to show you is that phonics and phonemic awareness are kind of the roots of the tree. They're the foundational pieces for children to begin to understand words. And I put vocabulary down there because just for the thing that I explained, that you have to know words and their meanings to help you with reading. And then you can see that fluency is the trunk of the tree, and it leads to comprehension and also to vocabulary growth, that you acquire more vocabulary. But the thing about fluency is that if you don't end up being a fluent reader, if you're very slow and you struggle, you're not going to be able to read fast enough to take yourself from figuring the words out to making meaning of connected text. So that's why fluency ends up being kind of a key piece. And the other thing is that we acquire most of our vocabulary through our reading, even for children, especially for adults, but even for children. And the problem is for children who are hesitant readers or struggling readers, they read less words per month or per year than their more able peers. And that's how the reading gaps occur, because you have to be able to read lots of words to be able to learn what new words are. Okay, oh, here we go. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk about is matching books to readers. The idea that we want to find books that are just right books, maybe for the kids that we're working with. And you may have heard of some of these leveling systems out in the world and also in trade books. There's a Lexile Level, and that uses a readability formula that looks at the number of words in a sentence, the complexity of the words, how many syllables they are, and then also the complexity of the sentence, how many words it has and how it's constructed. And so I think it's Scholastic now that has the rights on Lexile. So they have a system where they can basically figure out a level for all the text. And Lexile numbers range from about 100 to up to, I guess, like 1,000 or 1,200, but they don't exactly correlate with grade levels. The other thing you can do is sometimes books are labeled with grade levels. They'll say appropriate for first grade, second grade. And so that might be a way. And there are also things in schools called leveled readers, where authors have designed specific books that work incrementally, get slightly harder with each level of book. And so schools use that for guided reading when they run small groups where kids are reading a just right book that only has a couple things that challenge them so they can use their skills. So that's about book levels. Now, in order to find out a student's reading level, like what kind of text they're reading, what level text they can read and understand, schools use a variety of assessments. They use something called the DIBELS, the Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. And that has a series of tests that address all these 5 components of reading. And that can generate a reading level that will tell you if you're reading kind of at the beginning of first grade, like 1.2, or towards the end of first grade, 1.8, 1.9. There's also a MAP test, which is, I believe, group administered, and also CBM, which is group administered. But the thing that Lower Merion Schools is using right now is level book assessments, where they have students read those leveled books that are written at particular levels, and they have students read them and then do a comprehension response. And they try and find out what's the hardest book that a child can read on their own and make sense of, because your reading level has to be a level where you can comprehend the text. If you can just say all the words, but you can't make meaning of it, then that's not technically your reading level. And then reading levels, especially in schools, address kind of 3 different ways, 3 different ranges of how students read. It's their independent level, things that they can read easily by themselves and make meaning from. Their instructional level, that's the idea that you use for guided reading when you're helping to coach kids to do just a little bit more. And then the frustration level, which you really hope not to have children read books at a frustration level, but it happens for readers who are either struggling or slightly behind. When you start getting into content area text, that can happen. Okay, and then the next part of matching books to readers is just the idea of how do we connect where students are in terms of their reading and the books. And what I want to say for people who are going to be working with children one-on-one or with their own children or grandchildren or friends and family is that children can choose to read a book on any level. And all that changes by the book level is the level of support. That's what changes. And so, for instance, if you're with a child who's a beginning reader and you think maybe they're reading a book that's too easy because you know they know it, and they might even have memorized it, they might even have heard it so many times they've memorized it, and they're really excited to open the book and read all the words and just keep going through the book. And it's okay for them to read books that are too easy, because it's really great for them. It supports reading fluency and also their enjoyment and also their sense of accomplishment that I can read this. And it's especially great for fluency because they have a chance to read and reread and really work on thinking about, what does this text mean? And am I reading it in such a way that that gets conveyed? It's also okay to read books that are too hard if the right amount of support is provided. Lots of times students will be interested in books that are a little too hard for them to read independently because they really like the pictures, the author, the content of the book. And so sometimes when books are a little too hard, there are things you can do to support readers. So if that's the content they really want to read, they can still do that. One of the things that we teach students when they're going to do their own book selection for independent reading, one of the things you can teach students to do, and you can teach the children you work with, is called the 5-finger rule. And you open up the book to the middle of the book, usually not the first page. Yeah, I've got my book, Building Manhattan. And what you do is you start reading on the page, and every time you come to a word that you either can't decode or you don't know what it means, you can't make a good guess, every time you come to a word that's too difficult, you just put up a finger. And so if before you finish that page, you get to 5 fingers, then you wave the book goodbye. And that means that's not the book for you to read all by yourself. And you just say 5 fingers, goodbye book, and then you look for another one. I'm going to stop sharing right now. Autumn, I think because I'm certainly ahead of my timing, would it be okay if we opened it up for Q&A now? And it also turns out I can't look at I can look at the chat now. Okay, so I can check the chat now. So if you have a question about anything we've talked about, or even a comment, feel free to either speak if Autumn lets us in the chat, or speak or raise your hand. Alyssa, did you have a question? Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to call on you. This is probably like Zoom teaching where students are trying to be attentive but not get called out. Okay. Hey, if anyone has a question, go ahead and wave your hand. Oh, people are good. Okay. I will go back to sharing my screen. Okay. Oh, not this one. So sorry. There we go. Okay. So now that we've talked about what's required for reading, we've talked about phonemic awareness and phonics, fluency, and then vocabulary and comprehension. And we've talked about how books are at different levels and readers are able to read books at different levels more or less easily. We can talk about ways to read to children. And this is if you're going to do something like just read aloud a book to a child where you're going to do all the work. You're going to do the reading and they're going to listen and follow along and think about the book with you. One of the things you can do that's really helpful is to preview the text. And that's where you look at the front cover of the book and you read the title. And then you might even think about what you think the book's going to be about just from the title. And then what you do is you go through the book and look at the pictures and look and see what's happening in the pictures, see what characters might be there, what they're doing. And then you can also talk about what you already know and what you might find in a story. Today, I was reading Nature's, Grossest Things in Nature. Chicks eat vomit. Basically they're talking about how birds regurgitate their food and feed it to their babies. So when I was reading with my student today, we just looked at all the pictures in the book, first the photographs, and talked about the fact that it was all birds. We talked about a fact that it was usually an adult bird and a baby bird. And when we saw what was happening and we thought about what might we learn, and we also thought about what we already knew. For example, my student knew that that's how birds fed their children and that's how they had to eat. So we talked about that first, and then we started reading. The other thing to do when you're doing a read aloud one-on-one with like 1 or 2 children is to just stop for discussion. And you can stop anytime you find something that interests you or that interests the child. And also, I just wanted you to know that schools, I've noticed this right now for my daughter in Lower Merion, is when they talk about having readers make connections for comprehension, they ask students, what connections can you make to the story? What connections can you make to the text? They're looking for three different kinds of connections. They're looking for text to self. So is, how have I had an experience in my life, or a question or thought in my life that relates to what's happening to the characters in the story? The other one is text to text. Is this story like something else I've read? Is it like something I've read that's nonfiction that's talking about something, or is it like another book? You do this when you teach genres. If you teach fairy tales or folk tales, you often talk about how one story is similar to other stories you've read, and the fact that fairy tales almost always start with once upon a time as a key. So we look at that. And then the third connection they ask students to make is text to world. Is, how is this story related to things that happen in the world, things that I know about, or things that we see other people do, to make that connection? How can we learn about our world through that story? Then I had talked earlier about retelling, which is a slightly easier version of summarizing. When you're doing a retelling, you're really trying to capture the sense of the story and convey as much of it as possible with as many details to make it exciting. When you do a summary, you're really trying to get the main ideas and maybe just some key details. But retelling is something that we work with younger readers and kind of move into summarizing. And so one of the ways you can work on retelling a story is to do the 5-finger retelling. And that's to talk about the setting where the story takes place, the characters, who's in the story, the problem, what's wrong, then the events, what happens after a problem has occurred, and then the solution. So you can do a 5-finger retelling. Sometimes schools have a picture with a hand on it, and then students write the details at the point of each finger. Another thing that's being used that I'm seeing right now in schools is the somebody wanted but so way of retelling. And what that is somebody, that's the main character, wanted, and that's something they wanted or their goal. So for example, the 3 bears wanted to eat their porridge, but it was too hot. So they went for a walk in the woods. Then Goldilocks came into their house. While she was there, she tried all their porridge and ate some. She tried all their chairs and broke one. She tried all their beds and slept in one. Finally, the bears came home and wondered what had happened and found Goldilocks in the bed. So if you're reading with a child and you can help them after the story to do a retelling, just a spoken retelling, it will help them think about grabbing like the meaning of the text and kind of holding on to that. Okay, we're going to move on to, this is reading with. So if you're working with a child who has a book they want to read and the book is a little too hard or even a lot too hard for them to read, there are a number of things you can do. One of them is you can do echo reading, which is just as it sounds. You read a line and then they'll read the same line after you. And you can do that with short texts or maybe with poems or rhymes. Today I was reading The Stinky Cheese Man to a first grader, and there's a part where the Stinky Cheese Man says, "Run, run as fast as you can. You can't catch me. I'm the Stinky Cheese Man." So we did that as echo reading. And then whenever that showed up in the story, I would point to the words, and then my first grader would read that part and be the Stinky Cheese Man. Another thing you can do is to do partner reading. This was developed, I think, at the University of Delaware, especially for volunteers who are going to be working with students. When it was the America Reads Challenge way back during President Clinton's presidency. It was the America Reads Challenge. It was the idea of harnessing as many reading specialists, teachers, and volunteers and parents to help children improve their reading. And what happens in this case is the child reads out loud and you read along with them. You're reading along with them, but you read slightly slower than they do and quietly so that they're really controlling the reading. But if they start to struggle on a word, you can step in with that word, or if they're starting to struggle on a number of words, then you step in and you read at the regular reading pace and you read more loudly when they struggle. So it's kind of like, it's not like driving a car, that would be a bad example, but it's kind of like if you're if you're helping someone ride a bicycle, you want them to do as much steering as possible, but when they have trouble, you can reach over and assist. And then they also remind you that when you're doing this kind of reading, is you want to keep going, even if you encounter things that seem difficult or complicated or unknown words. What you can do is you can just keep going to give the idea so the child feels like what it feels like to read connected text and read with fluency. And then you can always stop later to talk about words or to reread. The other thing you can do is if you have a child who really wants to engage with a book that's quite above their reading level, but they're very interested in the story or in the content. And tutors often do this when they're working with struggling readers in school settings or out of school settings, is you can do something called language experience. And so what you can do is you'll read the story or the article about silkworms or the article about Pokemon, and you'll read it. You'll probably do all the reading and read it out loud. And then you'll talk about it with the child. And then what you'll do is you'll ask the child to tell you what were things they liked about the story or learned in the passage or are very important. And then you'll write down what the child says. And so you'll write down, like, it was a book about bears who didn't like their food and they went away, and a girl with yellow hair came and ate all their food. And then they found her in the bed. So you could just take the words that the child says and you write them down in your best handwriting. And then you have that, and they have that, and then that's something they can read with you, and they can take that away as a copy of something they can read independently based on what they wanted to read. The other thing you can do is if you're working with readers who are very fluent and comfortable, kind of with children who would love to show you how well they can read, you can let them read to you out loud, or if they want to read it independently, you can discuss it with them. Sometimes it's really great if you are reading the same book that a child is reading and you can talk about the book. But even if you haven't read the book, you can still have a discussion with them and ask them about the book and what they like about it, who they might recommend it to, and what they think is good about the book and that's interesting for children. You can also do that making connection piece of how can they connect that story to other texts, to themselves, to the world. And you can also help them with retelling, is have them retell the story and tell the important parts. The other thing you can do if you have a student or a child who's a really strong reader is have them work on fluency and say to them, you're reading this book really well. I wonder if you would like to practice reading it so you could read this to someone else, to someone who can't read the book, and have them work on that and let them pick the section that they'd like to reread and the section that they think is the one they most want to practice. And you can do two things. You can read the section to them first to model good reading. You're going to model reading accurately and with good phrasing and good expression, and also stopping at the periods and pausing at the commas. But then if they are already a pretty fluent reader and maybe they don't need that kind of reinforcement, what you can do that's really fun is you can read it to them in a monotone voice. Be sure and cruise through all the punctuation and not read it in a helpful way. And then you say to them, did I do a good job of reading that? And you may have to encourage them to be like, no, you did not. And then ask them what you should do to improve how you could read that. How could you read that more fluently? And then you read it again using the suggestions that they gave you. And then once you've picked a section and the child's ready to go, if possible, if you can do it, you really want the child to read the section out loud 3 times. And every time they read it, you're going to give them feedback on how well it went. You can say, I saw that you stopped at all the periods. I love the way you raised your voice at the end of a question. I loved how you did the phrasing. So you made it clear that these words were describing, how the tree looked in the winter. And then when they read it again, you'll also give them feedback. And then also the 3rd time. So they have a sense of how to read fluently, and then how to even improve on reading fluently. Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. I think, let's open it up. Okay, I'm going to stop my sharing.
Hi, can you go back to your contact screen? I want to write down your email.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, no problem. There we go.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, now I can look at the chat.
All right, so why don't we open it up to questions?
Great.
Like we said, you can use chat, or if you want to raise your hand, or if you want to just unmute and speak, as long as we don't speak over everybody, I think that's fine.
I have a question. Does the library have children's books on an electronic format?
On an electronic format.
Like, you know, like instance, I had told Tiz about the way I sometimes read with my grandchildren who live in Michigan. My daughter-in-law gets children's books, electronic books that you can put on your computer and read them. And she borrows them from their library. And, you know, they're just the pages of the book. So you have the illustrations and the words, and the kids are looking at it on their screen, and we Zoom together, and I look at it on my screen and we read together. And it's an amazing thing to do if you want to read to people who are far away.
Yes, I am not an expert on the resources of our junior room. I do know through Libby and Hoopla, our reading apps, you can get children's books that way. And you can specifically filter it out to be just children's. And there are a lot of resources online as well that our children's librarian can certainly point you to. I don't know. I think Jean Knapp is on here. I don't know if she wants to add any input on that one, but they have tons of resources for that kind of stuff.
I don't really have much to add other than what you said. I mean, they do purchase online children's materials, yes.
Great. I saw two questions in the chat that I can address. The first one was, how would you help to support the social emotional needs a student might have if they're behind in reading? And one of the things that I was trying to do when I work with students on reading is to point out to them that reading, it isn't natural and it isn't easy, and that everyone has to learn to read. And so everyone's on a path, and some people are farther ahead on a path than others. I worked with a neighbor who's younger than my daughter and has dyslexia. And so I was tutoring her in reading. And what I ended up saying to her is I said, you are much smarter than I am, or Katie, because you have to work so much harder to read than we do. We were lucky that we just got it and can make the things go, but you are using so many strategies and so much concentration that you are super smart. One time I was watching her read and she didn't recognize a letter, and I heard her saying to herself, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, until she got to the name of that letter. And then from knowing that, she made the sound and she was able to sound out the word. And she just worked so hard on that. And it was very impressive. And one of the things I did with her is we worked on making words. What I found, in fact, in addition to dyslexia, she also had an issue with recall, kind of like, what's it called? Just like knowledge recall, and able to access information she already had. It was kind of what they call soft knowledge, that some days she knew it and some days she didn't. So one of the things we worked on is we always worked on making words. We had letter tiles, like letter cards, and I would put the letter cards out and I would say a word and see if she could make it. And she found it much, much easier to write, to make the words, than she did to read the words. So that was great for her because she was very good at that. So we always made words with the letter tiles. And then we did sight words. Those are those words that you can't decode easily. Words like the, is, said, they're not super regular in terms of phonics. So you teach them as sight words. You also teach them words that are just very common as sight words like and, if, but even though you can decode them, you just teach them so that they can be quick and automatic. So we would work on making words and then on sight words. And you always do the thing if you have a couple words they know and you only insert 1 or 2 words that are unknown, so you kind of build. And it's so interesting. It really is true that if you use words that children already know and add in the new words, the support of having read a word they do know helps them read a word that's not as easily known to them. So you really always have, the guy who only did 5 words at a time, it was always 3 that were well known, and then maybe at the most 2 that weren't known. And then from there, we would move into reading, and we'd always do preview of the text and then read. And we also always reread at the beginning of every session. Is I had her read a book that was familiar to her, that she'd read before, that she could read easily and that she liked. And I'm so sorry I did not bring them. For kids who are beginning readers, there are 2 different kinds of books for kids that happen. One is called either decodable books, and they have controlled vocabulary. So they have kids only read words that they already know because they've been taught a sound blend or a blend. So you end up reading words like books like, oh, Matt the rat, and somebody and then Jack the cat. And so they're friends and they do things about being flat on a mat. They have a spat. And so all those things, and the stories end up being perfectly interesting, and they're not great literature, but they're perfectly interesting. And so kids really like to read them because they can read them, because you've set them up to be successful and know how to read all the words. I've been using the Bob books and really enjoying them. Then the other books I have is I have leveled readers that I've gotten from schools and from conferences I've been to, and leveled readers for either like reading recovery or for balanced literacy guided reading. They're books that are designed to be a certain level of ease of reading. And the set I'm reading, it's all the sentences are pattern sentences, kind of like I see this, I see this, I see this. And then the last sentence is usually a change, and it's usually a joke in the ones we're reading, which is great. I have one about a pirate who's looking for the treasure, and he looks, it's like, is it in the hole? No. Is it in the cave? No. Is it by the sea? No. And then they find it, and the treasure is jelly beans. And the pirate looks really, really just sad about that. Very, very disappointed. And so that book always has a joke, and it has a ton of picture support. So if you struggle with the words, you can look at the pictures to get support. And so that's a different kind, that's a leveled reader. And with my student, I use both leveled readers and decodable readers to have both kinds of print. Let me see if any other questions have popped up. Okay, and then, okay. Okay, I'm looking at the question about the student with dyslexia and her readers aren't interested to her. Oh, right. I encountered that also with 2 students that I've worked with. And the problem is that the books they've been given, they're just too hard for them. There are too many words per page, and there's too much of a struggle. And so if they're reading it in school, more power to them. But if you're working with them at home, then you don't want to do that. I saw some of the things come home from, I think it's Level Literacy Intervention, LLI, Laura Marion's using that. And the problem I noticed with the books that came home is they were the black and white books. They're like printed on newsprint, so the illustrations weren't high quality. They were photos that just weren't high quality. And then the text was okay, but it wasn't super interesting, and there was just too many words per page. And what I often do for readability is if I can read it upside down very easily, then that's usually good for a beginning reader, because that means the text is clear, there's enough spacing, it's regular enough. So if I can turn it upside down and read it very easily, then I know my struggling readers can do that. So what I discovered with those books is I did not want to use them with my student because they weren't interesting to me and I can read. So so what I do in that case is I have other books, but if you don't have other books, you could also do language experience. You could say, hey, let's make our own book with these pictures because we know what's going on. So you could read the text out loud, or you could just look at the picture and write your own words. And you probably only write 2 sentences if you have someone who's struggling, and you just write about 2 sentences, maybe 3, maybe 1 even per page. And then you put that together, and that can be the book you work on. Oh, the library also has books that will be helpful. They have the Bob books. They have sets of the Bob books, and Bella Kinwood Library upstairs. It's on the shelf near the computers. And then the other books I've used the Biscuit series. Biscuit's the puppy, and it has controlled vocabulary. It's kind of like Dick and Jane. It's the same words. So you can use the Biscuit books. There are other books like that. You can use the Bob books. And then they also have the I Can Read series. Now, the thing about those that you want to be careful is their leveling is much wider than schools use. Like some of the I Can Read series books, they have wide levels, and Step Into Reading has really wide levels. Like level 1 can go all the way from kindergarten up to almost 2nd grade. And then number 2 is also wide. Number 3 is wide. Because I had a friend who said, I don't know if my daughter's a great reader because she's struggling with this book. And I looked at it upside down, and she was in the beginning of 1st grade. And I said, it's okay if she can't read that. This is hard. This is hard for her at this level. Yeah, so be careful with the levels of trade books for that. But definitely the Bob books and language experience. And then also, if you have a child that's disinterested in reading the text they're given, you might even want to go right into language experience and have them draw their own book. For this girl I worked with, she told me she went to write her own version of the story. So she wrote that we were writing about the sleepy tiger, and so she made her name. So her name was Katie, my daughter's name. She wanted to write the sleepy Katie. So she told me the text, and then I wrote it out. I typed it out for her. I used a magazine. What is it called? Those e-magazines? It's zines that teenagers make. There's a program online that lets you type the text, and it will print it out in magazine format on the pages. So I did that, and then I gave it to her, and then she could illustrate it. So I did that. Okay. For minority readers, you want to look at the series. Yes, you're right that so many books are all white characters. Interestingly enough, Dick and Jane came out with a family that she had a family near her that were African Americans, and that came out in 1965, the last year that those were published. The other thing you can do is you can look for series of books about Black characters. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on some of the names. If you go to the I Can Read series, you'll find a couple series that feature Black kids. And then there's also, oh my gosh, Katie read some in 2nd grade. It's a series about a girl who goes to Washington and goes somewhere else, and she's Black. And then also, if you're going to do read aloud, I recommend the stories Julian Tells, which is by Anne Cameron. And that's an oldie but a goodie. And then there's another one, More Stories That Julian Tells, and he is Black and his family is Black, and then he has other friends of other races. Oh, and the very interesting thing, when I read it with kids in Camden this summer, I had always thought of him as Julian, and they referred to him as Julian, and his brother, who I call Huey, they called Ooey. And it was great. It definitely expanded my take on that book, but they really liked that. I read that with kids years and years and years ago when I was student teaching, but it's still great, still a great one. But there's definitely an I Can Read series that will address that. I am blanking on the name. I'll try and think of that. Okay, let me look in the chat. Oh, right. Okay. And then someone asked about their 3.5-year-old grandson who's memorized a book. That's great if they've done that. Like, memorizing a book is great because you then can get it's great because they feel like readers, they're confident, so they're real readers. And what you can do is you can do a couple of things. Is you can one thing you can do is you can have your grandson read the book to you and just give lots of praise and positive reinforcement. And then you could do things about retelling. You could say, hey, can you tell me who the characters are in the book? And then you can say, what was the problem in the book? Like, what was going wrong? And then say, well, how did they address that? And kind of like, what happened first? What happened next? And do that. So take the fact that they've memorized the book, but treat it as though they are a real reader and have a conversation that you would have about a book. The other thing you can do is you can take a look at a page and say, oh, I see all these words on the page. Can you find a word that starts with a letter in your name? And then you'll see how they're doing in terms of letter to letter match. And then if that goes well, you can even say, oh, you know, this word is shows up all the time. Can you find is for me on the page? And if they can't find it, you can just point to it once and then say, do you see it on other places in the page, and just match it. And you say, right, that word is and. So you can take their kind of whole reading of a book and move into comprehension, and you could also move into particular words. You can also work on sounds. You can say, wow, there are a lot of B words on this page. Like one of them is bear, you know, it starts with the bus sound. What other words in this page start with that? So you really kind of unpack it and go back. If you could never tell them that they're not really reading, that would be awesome. That would be really good. So that's, I used to read to the daughter of the woman who cleaned our office. And so she would come by, and I used to read her one of the little critter books I just had. That was the one I had. It might not have been the best. So I read about the little critter was trying to help his mom with things, but the soap was too slippery. And so I would read the same book to her every time, and then we'd talk about it, and I'd always read it with expression. And one day I did not have time. I was finishing something on a deadline. So I said to her, I said, hey, I can't read. Can you read it to me today? And she did. And she read it almost word for word. But the thing that was so fun is that she read it with my expression. She said, oh, the soap is too slippery. And then after that, I gave her lots of praise. And I said, oh my gosh, you can read that book. That's amazing. You can do that. And then I said, why don't you go read it to somebody else? So she went around our office reading it to as many people as would listen. And then one of my colleagues came up to me later, and he said, you know, Carla came and read the book to me today. And she told me she was reading it, and she read it. He said, but she wasn't really reading it. And I looked horrified. And then I said, but you didn't tell her, did you? And he's like, oh no. I was like, oh, thank heavens. So that was a good start. Okay, let me look in the chat and see if there's anything else. Yes. Oh, thank you so much for Common Sense Media. There are now a lot more books with girls as active characters. I was just on Epic today. If you don't know Epic, it's an online book system. It has books that are organized by levels, by genre, by interest. And I was in the comics section, comics and animated things. And all of the books I found had the superhero was a girl and the lead protagonist was a girl. So I really find in new fiction, there's a lot more of that going on. And I was just reading a book about fairies to my first grader because she was really interested in it. And it's one of those, I think it's like a scholastic book where it sells, but it's not the best literature. And so the problem with those is that as an adult, they're painful to read out loud. And then it reminded me of The Princess in Black, the series of books where there's a princess who is a superhero, and her alter ego is like that she's a very, you know, pristine, very pretty princess, but then she becomes kind of a do-gooder and also just very adventurous with her pony. And there's about 6 of those nice illustrations, and they're good. They're so fun to read aloud, and they would be good for end of beginning readers because they have a really nice layout, not too many words per page, repeated words, and the words that you can't decode independently are very funny. It's words like frimple pants. So you might end up just telling them anyway. Okay.
Can you hear me? You touched on comics for a second there. Can you just talk about the graphic novels for a second? Because I know, you know, at first I felt as if my son wasn't really, you know, he didn't want to start getting into chapter books. And I was afraid that picture books were going to drag out a little too long and that he wasn't going to develop. But then, you know, he got to an age where graphic novels became popular. And I just want your, your professional take on, reading development and how graphic novels fit into that.
Oh, graphic novels are great, and they're great for just that reason for people, for students who are reluctant to move into chapter books. And what's great about graphic novels is if you look at them, they'll end up having a lot of words per page, but they also have a lot of picture support, and they also have characters that reoccur in multiple books. I'm thinking of Dogman, the Dogman series, that once you learn about Dogman and Pete the cat, what was it? Evil Petey the cat, and the evil characters, that's there, and that all provides support that makes things easier to read. A colleague once said to me, he said, I wasn't a strong reader early on, and he said, I always read murder mysteries because if I read the same genre, I know what to expect, and I'm set up to expect, the protagonist, a murder, someone solves the murder, people lie, people tell the truth, and at the end they'll solve it. And so the more you know about something going in, the easier it is to read. So if you've read a Dogman book or had it read to you, when you go to read the next one, you're going to be in much better shape because you already know what the story is going to be like, the structure of the story, the characters, you kind of know the funny words, and and then you also have all that great picture support that supports that. I've noticed my daughter has read the Raina Telgemeier books, like ghost drama. I can't think of the other ones. And so those are graphic novels, but those are very complex text, complex ideas. And so it's the same kind of content you would get in a chapter book for older readers, but there's the picture support and just the sense that maybe it's more fun. So, I mean, I really am impressed in what graphic novels have done to support students and just also to turn on people's interest in reading.
I have a question. Coming from a university student and somebody who's going into library science as a career, maybe like a school librarian, like what connections, like if you want to incorporate learning literacy like this into a library, how can you connect to schools to have like a collaboration for reading, or is it like a library can be a source for teaching on its own? Because I don't often see like a library as it's sort of like a repository for books and not just like an extension of the classroom. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Are you going to be a public librarian or like a school librarian?
I'm thinking school librarian.
Okay. What I've noticed in some schools is that school librarians will do like library lessons. So they'll have particular things they want to teach and certain ideas they want to do. So sometimes they'll teach about genres, like they'll do folk tales, fairy tales, they'll talk about that, or they'll teach about characters or kindness, or for older kids, they'll teach about foreshadowing. It works the best when the librarian can, it's hard to do this. It works the best when librarians line up with classroom teachers so that they're talking about the same things that teachers are talking about. The other thing that I've seen in libraries that's wonderful is if you can talk to the librarian and tell them what kinds of books you'd love for your students to look at when they come down. And so I had that, the librarian would pick out animal stories because that's what we were working on. So she would pull the animal stories that were appropriate for my first grade and put them around so that when they did book selection, it was like pre-selected for them. The WEPAC librarian at Huey in Philadelphia would do the same thing. They always pick books that were about the right reading level and also books that would be high engagement, and they would put those out for students to look at, and they would break the class into two groups, and they'd have a fun literature related art activity for half the class so that the adults could focus on helping the students pick the just right book. So yeah, so it's hard. It depends on your school and your district. Some places, they definitely have a library curriculum. They'll have things they want you to teach and reinforce related to the English language arts standards. And so maybe some districts will have you teach your stuff. And then other districts may give you more leeway to partner with teachers, which would be wonderful. And you could also imagine a push-in time where you would go with books and bring them to the classroom and kind of share them. And so you and the classroom teacher would be there to help the kids look at the books and identify books that would be useful. Yeah, I always love it when you could have more than one adult in the room, because it really gives you a chance to have someone kind of monitoring and someone providing more one-on-one support. Now, in schools that have instructional aides, like Lower Marion, that's not an issue, but places like Southeast Delco and Philadelphia, the more people power, the better.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was
Okay.
informative.
Great. And I also want to throw this to public librarians. Can you talk about, because you make lots of connections to what's going on in schools.
We have Jean, if you have any thoughts, our head librarian or our librarian for the children's department, she's absolutely top notch. I'm not sure how many of you talked to her, Jane France, but she's very active and very involved in all the schools and daycares, getting in touch and working with the schools and daycares in our area.
I'm actually I worked for Lower Marion. I was a page at Belmont, so I know Jane, and I'm glad that
you?
yeah, I can make that connection there. That's really cool.
Yeah, she's absolutely top notch, and just very active in the community with that kind of stuff. Elizabeth, there's I like this question, the next question in the chat about audiobooks for reluctant readers.
Yes.
Is that helpful? Is that a hindrance?
Oh, it's very helpful. I noticed that Epic has a lot of books on it that are called Read to Me. They have a little label on the bottom. And so if you have that book, you just can open it and the book, they'll read it to you as you turn the pages. Those are great for reluctant readers and great for struggling readers. I taught at Stratford Friends School, which is a school for children with learning differences, and everyone had either ADD or ADHD and dyslexia, which is a bad combination because it's just really hard. So I taught there, and one of the things we did is you preload all the content before you ask people to read, like in a general ed setting. Sometimes what you do is you read the books, you write the papers, you make something, and then you go on the trip to the farm after you've been studying about farms. And what Stratford Friends did is you start with the trip. You go there first, you see everything in person, close at hand, and learn about it, ask questions. Then you watch the movies, then you watch the film strips, then you build your village out of shoeboxes that represents the farming community. And then you move into doing the reading because you have so much background knowledge that will help you with the struggle in decoding or struggle in comprehension. I used to raise silkworms with my first graders. I have a teacher friend who's kept that going and would give me silkworm eggs. So we would raise them in the classroom, and everyone would have their own silkworms that mostly stayed in the classroom. And my silkworm friend, the silkworm lady, gave me some books that were really at the second grade level, but had a lot of really good information about silkworms and their life cycles and great photographs. So I put one or two of those books down at a table with some of my boys who I knew were not strong readers. And then I was circulating the room because we were doing buddy reading where you read with a friend, and I was checking in with other groups. And when I got back there, I said to them, I said, hey, so how's it going? And they told me things they had learned that I knew they didn't know that they'd gotten from the book. Well, actually, I said to them, I said, how did you learn those things? How do you know that? And they said, oh, we read it in the book. And I was like, wow, because it was hard text, complex multi-syllable words, long sentences, but they had so much background knowledge and also so much motivation and experience and interest that they were able to work with it. So I should also do that more in my tutoring. The more you can front load the content that you can have kids reading things they already know about, it really helps. And also to have them understand that when we read, we're always reading things that we already know something about. We're reading something that we're interested in or that we need to read. Like when we go to read the directions for the Fios remote, we know that we have a Fios remote, we know it has buttons. Or if we want to read a book about turtles, we're interested in turtles. Is that once you get to read on your own, you get to read what you want to read, you get to read it how you want to read it, and no one will ask you to write a paper about it.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Thank you so much for your great questions. Right. And as you already know, the Bala Cynwyd Library has great resources. They have great book collections, and Jane is a great expert on that. I've also been really impressed with the programs they offer in terms of arts and crafts and the STEM programs, like how well they line up with what kids are doing in schools because they're looking at the state standards. And then also the other thing is, in talking to Jane, is libraries are great because they're so good at harnessing lots of different resources and contacts. So when I go back to a school setting, I'm definitely going to reach out to my public library because sometimes they can pull in people like community gardener people or people who are experts in things, like they can help pull resources together in ways that even more easily than teachers can.
Yes, if anybody has any questions at all, Jane France, our children's librarian, like I said, is top notch, and she can certainly help anybody out. All right, well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for all of this valuable information. This was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you for your great questions. And please feel free to contact me. If you forget my contact information, I bet you could leave a note at the library and someone will give it to me if I'm very nice. So please feel free to reach out at any time. And Alyssa, good luck to you. I'm so glad you're going to do this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Great.
Have a great night.
And thank you, Elizabeth,
Thank you.
our speaker. We really, really appreciate your giving us a little preview of all of your knowledge. Thank you very much. We look forward to having another adult program next month. We're hoping to have an expert in Kabbalah come and speak. And in January, we are having a meditation session. So those are the next two. Keep your eyes peeled, look at your email. You'll be getting a lot of information coming up on all of the new programs. Thank you very much. Remember
Good night,
your
everyone.
library
Night,
in your
good night.
remember your library in your end of year giving. Thank you.
Good night.